Why did the range suddenly feel colder the moment she stepped forward? Not colder in temperature, colder in spirit. 46 rifles rested on racks behind her. 47 Marines stood in formation. 47 futures balanced on one narrow stretch of gravel and steel. And in James Sullivan's hands was a rifle that didn't want to cooperate. The stock creaked faintly when she shifted her shoulder. The scope trembled with the smallest movement. The trigger didn't break clean, it dragged, like it was thinking about betraying her. Everyone on the range knew that rifle was damaged. Everyone. She had been handed it on purpose. Lieutenant Garrett had smiled when he gave it to her that morning, not a wide smile, not a cruel grin. Just the kind of quiet curve of the lips that said, "You won't say anything, and I know it." She hadn't. Now she stood alone at the firing line, wind brushing her sleeves, eyes tracing the first steel silhouette 6 football fields away. 1 shot per target. Miss more than 3, and you go home. She felt a familiar ache press against her ribs, the old feeling, the one she'd carried since week 1. The feeling of being watched for failure. The range officer's voice cut clean through the air. "Shooter ready." James exhaled, long, controlled, steady, and rested her cheek against the cracked stock like it was an old friend who'd been hurt but not abandoned. She squeezed. The rifle barked. A pause. Then the spotter's call. Hit. A few eyebrows lifted, nothing more. Lucky, they thought. She slid to the next target, adjusted slightly, breathed again. Another shot. Hit. The murmuring started. She didn't look back. Because she knew something they didn't. She had already learned how to survive broken things. Why did she never tell anyone how lonely her first night in sniper school had felt? 50 candidates, 3 women, 47 reasons to disappear into the background. But Lieutenant Garrett hadn't let her. His eyes had found her immediately. You. Just one word, but it landed like a stone. He'd circled her slowly, measured her height, her build, her silence. You think you belong here? He'd asked, voice smooth and cold. She hadn't raised her chin. She hadn't argued. She had simply said, "Yes, sir." And from that moment on, the course became different for her. Heavier packs. Worse firing positions. Longer navigation routes. The kind of quiet pressure meant to make someone quit without ever needing to say you should leave. Her shoulders had bled beneath straps. Her legs had burned in the dark. Her hands had blistered, split, hardened. And every night she'd sat alone on her bunk, staring at the ceiling, whispering the same 3 words under her breath. Patience. Breathing. Physics. Words her grandfather had taught her when she was 10 years old, kneeling beside her at a small Wyoming range, adjusting her elbows, steadying her breath. Shooting isn't strength, he'd told her. It's understanding. He had made her practice in snow, in rain, in wind so heavy the targets blurred. By the time she was 18, she could outshoot grown men who'd been firing rifles for decades. But she'd never told anyone. Not in school, not in town. And not here. Because this place didn't reward quiet confidence. It tested it. Why did the entire range fall silent after target number 20? By then, James hadn't missed once. Not a single steel plate had stood untouched. The broken rifle jumped unpredictably, and she compensated. The loose scope drifted, and she recalculated. The wind shifted, and she adjusted without anyone seeing the math in her eyes. By target 30, even the instructors leaned forward. By 40, nobody breathed. Garrett's jaw tightened. He watched her the way someone watches a door that refuses to stay closed. She wasn't supposed to be doing this. Not with that rifle. Not after the way he'd treated her. Not after the pressure, the weight, the isolation. But she wasn't shooting with anger. She wasn't shooting with pride. She was shooting with memory. Every squeeze of the trigger echoed 8 years of Saturdays beside her grandfather. Every adjustment was muscle memory layered with physics. By the time she reached target 44, 1,000 meters heat mirage bending the air, she barely noticed the crowd. She whispered just once, "Steady." She fired. Hit. A gasp rolled across the range like a wave. She never smiled. There were still 3 left. Why did Lieutenant Garrett finally look small? Target 47 waited. The hardest shot. Extreme angle, partial cover, maximum distance. The rifle's flaws vibrated in her hands, familiar now, almost gentle. She chambered the last round. This was the one he expected her to miss. She closed one eye. Breathed. Thought of a gravel range in Wyoming. A grandfather's voice. A promise she'd made to herself after a funeral. She squeezed. The rifle kicked. Time stretched. Then, hit. For half a second, no one spoke. And then the range erupted. James lowered the rifle quietly and stepped back, not triumphant, not defiant, just steady. Lieutenant Garrett didn't move. He only stared at the weapon he had used to try to end her dream. Why did her hands shake during graduation more than they ever had on the range? 13 candidates remained. Her name was called first. Perfect score. 47 for 47. When Garrett stepped forward, the room went silent again. He looked at her not as a target, not as a problem, as a Marine. "I was wrong," he said. And that was enough. Later that night, alone in her bunk, James unfolded a small, worn photograph. Her grandfather stood smiling beside a range sign. She touched the corner of it gently. "I didn't break," she whispered. And for the first time since week 1, the ache in her chest felt lighter. Some people are tested by fire. Some by distance. Some by doubt. James Sullivan was tested by quiet pressure, by being underestimated, isolated, and handed something broken. And she didn't complain. She didn't shout. She didn't demand fairness. She adjusted. She breathed. She calculated. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. Why did her hands feel heavier on the rifle that morning, even before anyone had said a word? It wasn't the weight of the weapon. She'd carried heavier packs through steeper ground in worse weather. It wasn't fear either. Fear had a sound to it, a kind of whisper in the chest. This was quieter. It was the feeling of being measured not for skill but for worth. James Sullivan stood at the edge of the Quantico range, boots aligned with the gravel line, eyes forward, jaw relaxed, shoulders squared. The morning sun hadn't fully burned the mist away yet. The targets downrange looked like pale ghosts drifting in a field of breath. Around her, the other candidates talked in low voices. Some stretched, some checked scopes, some laughed softly, pretending this was just another drill. James didn't join them. She had learned early that attention could be as heavy as any rucksack. When Lieutenant Garrett stepped onto the range, conversation fell away like leaves in winter. He had a way of walking that made people straighten before they realized they were doing it, shoulders back, chins lifted, expressions neutral. Not because they respected him, because they were waiting for him to choose a target. His eyes passed over the line once. Then they came back and stopped on her. "Corporal Sullivan," he said. The way he said her name made it feel smaller. "Yes, sir." He approached her slowly, hands behind his back, boots grinding lightly against the gravel. When he stopped, he didn't look angry. He looked thoughtful, like someone considering whether a problem was worth solving. "You sleep well last night?" he asked. "Yes, sir." A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Good, you'll need the energy. He turned away and raised his voice for everyone to hear. Today we're doing positional evaluation, limited stability, non-standard firing surfaces. Groans rippled quietly through the group. Jame already knew what that meant. When firing positions were assigned, she was placed on uneven ground, one knee braced against a root, her support elbow hovering instead of anchored. It was the kind of stance that punished even experienced shooters. She didn't protest. She lowered herself carefully, let her breathing settle, and brought her rifle up. The first target slid into view. She fired. Hit. The second. Hit. The third. Hit. Around her, rifles barked and steel rang, but a different sound began to follow her shots. Silence. Not respectful silence, curious silence. She stood, stepped aside, and slung her rifle. Garrett's gaze lingered on her longer than necessary. And in that look, there was no approval. Only calculation. That night, alone in the barracks, James sat on her bunk with her boots off and her hands resting on her knees. Her palms were raw, her shoulders ached, her thighs trembled faintly from the day's strain. She stared at the concrete floor, listening to the low hum of vents and the muffled laughter from the far end of the room. This was the part no one talked about, the waiting, the long stretches between drills when doubt had room to stretch its legs. She reached into her footlocker and pulled out the small photograph she kept tucked inside her field manual. Her grandfather stood in it, hat crooked, smile gentle, eyes squinting against the Wyoming sun. "You'd hate this place," she whispered. She could almost hear his chuckle. "Probably," she said quietly, "but you tell me to stay." Her chest tightened. He had taught her to shoot, yes, but more than that, he had taught her to finish things. He used to say, "A steady heart carries a steady hand." She lay back on her bunk, stared at the ceiling, and breathed until the ache eased. Tomorrow would be harder. It always was. Week 2. The navigation course. A sprawling maze of ridges, ravines, and dense woodland. Candidates were given coordinates, maps, compasses, and nothing else. Jame was assigned the longest route. Again. She didn't look surprised. She adjusted the straps on her pack, felt the familiar pressure settle across her shoulders, and stepped into the tree line with the others. Within the first mile, sweat soaked her collar. By the third, her calves burned. By the fifth, her breath came in sharp pulls. She didn't slow. She checked her compass, corrected her bearing, counted her paces. Around her, branches snapped. Somewhere ahead, someone cursed. She reached the first checkpoint early. The second on time. By the third, she was ahead of schedule. She didn't smile. She didn't announce it. She simply logged her position and kept moving. When she crossed the finish line hours later, Garrett stood with a clipboard. He looked at her time, then at her, then back at the clipboard. "Huh," he said flatly. That was all. But his jaw tightened. By week 4, the whispers had started. "She never misses. She doesn't complain. She's quiet, but she's solid." Jame heard them and pretended she didn't. She focused on her breathing, on her foot placement, on her shot cycle. Because something else had started too. The pressure. Not from the drills. From the eyes. From the way people watched her like she was something that might fail spectacularly and disappoint them all at once. She didn't want to be an example. She wanted to be invisible. But invisibility had already slipped through her fingers. The day of the stress shoot came without ceremony. A 3-mile run with full gear. Then immediately onto the firing line. Heart pounding, hands shaking, breath uneven. When Garrett handed her the damaged rifle for the first time, she felt it instantly. The loose scope. The warp stock. The imperfect trigger. Her eyes flicked up to his. Real shooters adapt, he said quietly. She nodded. Yes, sir. She took the rifle. Not because she trusted it, but because she trusted herself. As she jogged into the course, the rifle bounced awkwardly against her shoulder. Every step made it shift, rattle, protest. It felt wrong, but wrong had become familiar. She ran anyway. And somewhere between the pounding of her boots and the rhythm of her breathing, a calm settled into her chest. The same calm she'd felt as a girl, kneeling beside her grandfather while snow fell gently onto the range. She didn't know it yet, but this rifle would become part of her story. Not because it worked, but because she did. And the people watching her were about to realize that the quiet ones were not the weak ones. They were the dangerous ones, because they never wasted their strength on noise. Why did the air feel thinner the moment she lifted the damaged rifle into her shoulder, as if the range itself was holding its breath? Her pulse thundered in her ears, not loud, not wild, controlled, measured, the kind of rhythm you learn to ride instead of fight. Sweat darkened the collar of her uniform. Her lungs still burned from the 3-mile run. Her legs trembled faintly as she knelt on the gravel, the world narrowing to the warped stock pressed against her cheek. She could feel everything that was wrong with the rifle. The loose scope trembled in its mount like it didn't quite believe in its own position. The trigger dragged unevenly. The barrel didn't settle into stillness. It quivered, almost impatient. Lieutenant Garrett stood several meters behind her, arms crossed, posture relaxed. Too relaxed. He didn't need to say anything. The message had already been delivered with the weapon itself. Let's see how long you last. The range officer raised his hand. Shooter ready. Jane drew in a breath, slow and deep, filling the bottom of her lungs the way her grandfather had taught her. She didn't try to force calm. She let it arrive on its own. Target 1 slid into view. 300 meters. Crosswind left to right. Her eyes tracked the movement of the grass, the shimmer of heat mirage. She mentally measured drift, compensated for the scope's looseness, and adjusted her cheek weld to stabilize the warped stock. She squeezed. The rifle bucked. A half-second of silence. Then, hit. A few candidates glanced at each other. Lucky, they thought. James shifted her knee, recalculated, found the next silhouette. 450 meters. The wind gusted stronger now, teasing the tall grass into sudden waves. She didn't hesitate. She breathed out slowly. Squeezed. Hit. Her shoulders loosened just a fraction. She wasn't proving anything yet. She was simply settling into the work. Target 3. Target 4. Her heart still hammered, but her hands no longer shook. The rifle felt less like an enemy and more like a stubborn partner she had to lead instead of follow. Each shot landed true. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tone of the range changed. Boots stopped shifting. Conversations died. People leaned forward. Lieutenant Garrett straightened. James didn't see any of it. She was already calculating for Target 6. By the time she reached Target 7, something quiet but dangerous had formed inside her. Not anger. Not pride. Certainty. The certainty that comes when you realize the storm you feared is already inside you, and you've learned how to stand in it. Her breathing found its rhythm. In. Pause. Out. Squeeze. Hit. The damaged rifle rattled softly between shots, as if complaining but obeying. She made micro-adjustments with every round, changed her holds, repositioned her elbows, tilted her shoulders by fractions of inches. Not because she was nervous, because she was precise. Behind her a candidate whispered, "She's not guessing." Another murmured, "She's calculating." Garrett said nothing, but his jaw tightened. Her legs burned. Her back ached. Her pulse refused to slow. And still she moved forward. Target 8. Target 9. Each hit felt less like a victory and more like a quiet conversation with the wind, the distance, the broken mechanics of the rifle. She was learning its language. The way the trigger hesitated before releasing. The way the scope drifted when she exhaled too fast. The way the barrel pulled slightly right if she rushed. It wasn't sabotaging her anymore. It was teaching her. At target 10, the final silhouette of the stress chute, her lungs screamed for air. Her uniform clung damply to her back. Her vision blurred for half a second, and she paused. Not because she doubted. Because she respected the moment. She remembered her grandfather's voice again. "You never rush the last shot, you finish clean." She adjusted. She waited for the mirage to thin. She breathed once more. Then she squeezed. Silence. Then, hit. For a long moment, nobody moved. 10 for 10. Perfect. The range officer lowered his clipboard slowly. A few instructors exchanged looks. Lieutenant Garrett stared at her like he was seeing her for the first time, not as a candidate. As a variable he had not planned for. James stood, slung the rifle, and turned to leave. As she passed Garrett, she stopped. She didn't look at him. She simply said quietly, "Any weapons, sir?" Then she walked off the range. And in that single sentence, something shifted. Not just in the course, but in the story that had already started following her name. Why did the silence after her last shot feel heavier than any shout of praise ever could? Jane walked off the range with the damaged rifle resting against her shoulder, the strap cutting gently into her collarbone, the familiar ache settling into muscles that had learned how to endure without complaint. She didn't look back. She didn't search for reactions. But she felt them, the eyes following her, the unspoken questions drifting behind her like smoke. That day nobody laughed. Nobody whispered. Nobody predicted when she would quit. Something about her had shifted in the quiet minds of the candidates. The woman who had once blended into the background had become a presence, not loud, not flashy, but steady, unavoidable. Like a mountain you don't notice until you realize it has always been there. In the locker room later, boots thudded softly against the concrete. Zippers whispered. Lockers creaked open and closed. A candidate she barely knew sat down across from her and hesitated before speaking. "You didn't flinch," he said finally. Jane looked up. "During the last shot, most of us rush it." She considered his words, then shrugged slightly. "Rushing makes mistakes louder." He nodded, like he'd just been given something he hadn't known he needed. And then he left. James sat alone again, staring at her hands. They were rough now, scarred lightly across the knuckles, nails trimmed short, uneven. They didn't look like hands that had once held library books and math notebooks and school trophies. They looked like hands that had learned how to stay. Week 16 arrived quietly. Only 13 candidates remained. The rest had fallen away, some injured, some exhausted, some simply worn thin by doubt. The barracks felt emptier now, the laughter more forced, the nights longer. And Lieutenant Garrett had grown quieter. Not kinder. Quieter. He still assigned her heavier loads, still gave her worse firing angles, still found ways to push her beyond the line of comfort. But there was something new behind his eyes. Not contempt. Attention. He watched her like someone studying a lock that refuses to break. During a long-range cold bore drill, the wind shifted suddenly, fast, sharp, unpredictable. Several candidates missed. Jane didn't. Her shot rang clean. The instructor beside Garrett murmured, "She adjusts before the wind moves." Garrett said nothing, but his fingers tightened around his clipboard. That night, James lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of vents and the distant rumble of trucks beyond the base fence. She felt tired in a way that sleep didn't cure, the kind of tired that settles into bones. She thought about home, the quiet kitchen, the old coffee mug her grandfather had used, the faint smell of dust and oil that lingered in his workshop. She missed him more now than she had in years. Not just for what he had taught her, but for the way he had believed in her before she had learned to believe in herself. She whispered into the dark, "I'm still here." Not to anyone, just to the part of herself that sometimes wondered why she stayed. The final week crept closer. There was tension in the air, the kind that hums under the skin. Everyone knew what was coming. The qualification. 47 targets. 1 chance. 3 misses allowed. James cleaned her rifle carefully that evening, the damaged one still stored in her locker, untouched since the stress shoot. She ran her fingers along the warped stock, the loose scope mount, the worn barrel. It felt strange, familiar, almost honest. She didn't know why she hadn't asked for a different weapon. She only knew that part of her didn't want to, because something inside her wanted to finish what had started. The morning of the final qualification dawned pale and still. Fog hovered low over the range. Candidates stood quietly, checking gear, murmuring last-minute reminders to themselves. Lieutenant Garrett walked down the line and stopped at James. He handed her the same damaged rifle. "You did well with it last time," he said softly. Not mocking, not smiling, just stating a fact. James accepted it without a word. She slung it over her shoulder. And in that quiet exchange, everyone watching understood something unspoken. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a final test. And she was walking into it alone, not because she had been pushed there, but because she had chosen to stay. Why did her heartbeat sound louder than the range siren when she stepped onto the firing line for the last time? Not because she was afraid of missing, but because this was the end of something she had lived inside for months, and endings have a way of making even the strongest hands tremble. 47 targets weighted downrange. Steel silhouettes fading into heat shimmer, dust, distance, and wind. 1 shot each. 3 misses allowed. And in her hands, the same damaged rifle. The cracked stock pressed gently into her shoulder. The loose scope quivered faintly in its mount. The worn barrel felt warm beneath her palm, like it remembered her already. Around her, the world went quiet. The instructors stood rigid. The remaining candidates held their breath. Even the birds seemed to hesitate. Lieutenant Garrett stepped back. This time he did not smile. He simply nodded once. The range officer's voice rang out. "Shooter ready." James closed her eyes for half a second. Not to pray, to remember. A small range in Wyoming, cold air, her grandfather's hands adjusting her elbows. Don't fight the rifle, listen to it. She opened her eyes. Target 1, 200 meters. She breathed, squeezed, hit. A faint murmur rolled across the line. Target 2, 300 meters. Crosswind light. She adjusted. Hit. Target 3, 450 meters. Heat shimmer rippling. She paused just long enough to let the mirage settle. Hit. Something shifted in the air. By target 10, the whispers had stopped. By target 20, nobody moved. Every shot rang out like a quiet statement. Not loud. Not boastful. Just undeniable. Her breathing fell into a steady rhythm, in, pause, out, like a metronome guiding her hands. The broken rifle obeyed her now. She knew its moods, its drift, its hesitation. She wasn't fighting its flaws. She was working with them. Target 31. 600 meters. She leaned slightly into the stock. Hit. Lieutenant Garrett's jaw tightened. Target 35. 700 meters. A gust curled across the grass. She adjusted mentally. Hit. Someone exhaled loudly behind her, then realized they had broken the silence. Target 40. 800 meters. The longest distances now. The air shimmered, the wind teased the flags. James' shoulders burned. Her legs trembled faintly. But her hands were calm. Hit. She was no longer proving she belonged. She was simply doing what she had been trained to do. 7 targets remained. The range felt unreal, suspended in breath and dust. Target 41. 800 meters. She adjusted for the gust. Hit. A ripple of disbelief passed through the instructors. Target 42. 900 meters. Elevation chain. She recalculated. Hit. Lieutenant Garrett's hands clenched. Target 43. Moving silhouette. She tracked led slightly squeezed. Hit. 4 left. Her chest rose and fell slowly now, controlled, steady. Target 44. 1,000 meters. Maximum distance. Heat mirage bending the world. She waited. Waited. Then fired. Hit. Gasps broke the silence. 3 left. Target 45. She adjusted and fired. Hit. 2 left. Target 46. Wind shifting unpredictably. She leaned in, breathing shallow, slow. Hit. 1 left. Target 47. The hardest shot. Extreme angle, partial cover. Her final round slid into the chamber. The rifle felt familiar. Comforting. She closed one eye. Breathed once. Thought of a quiet voice that had once believed in her. She squeezed. Time stretched. Then, hit. The range erupted. But James didn't raise her arms. Didn't smile. She simply lowered the rifle and stepped back, steady, quiet, unbroken. Because she had never been fighting the targets. She had been finishing a promise. Why did her hands begin to shake only after everything was finally over? Not on the range. Not while the rifle was still warm. Not while 47 steel silhouettes stood silent in the dust. They shook later, when the noise had faded, when the crowd had thinned, when the pressure finally loosened its grip on her chest. Graduation morning arrived quietly. The barracks smelled faintly of detergent and boot polish. Sunlight slid through narrow windows and traced pale lines across the floor. 13 names remained on the roster, 13 out of 50. James stood in formation, her new uniform pressed crisp, her boots polished until they reflected light. Her posture was steady, but inside her chest something fragile fluttered, the soft kind of nervousness that comes only after survival, when your body finally realizes it is safe enough to feel. The commandant stepped to the podium. His voice was calm, even, but when he reached her name it softened. Corporal James Sullivan achieved a perfect final qualification. 47 targets, 47 hits. A murmur moved through the crowd. James stepped forward. She felt every eye on her, not doubting now, not measuring but witnessing. The pin was placed carefully on her uniform. For a moment, her throat tightened too much to speak. Then she saluted. Lieutenant Garrett stood. The room quieted instantly. He approached her slowly, his expression unreadable, Gone was the edge. Gone was the certainty. He stopped in front of her, paused, and met her eyes. "I was wrong," he said quietly. The words didn't echo, but they settled. "I tried to break you," he continued, voice low. "You didn't bend." His hand extended. She shook it. Not triumphantly. Not angrily. Simply. Later that night, the base lay quiet beneath a scatter of stars. James sat on her bunk and pulled the small photograph from her locker. Her grandfather smiled back at her, steady, familiar, patient. "I stayed," she whispered. "I finished." She pressed the photo gently against her chest. Outside, somewhere beyond the fence and the dust and the distance, there were other girls being told they were too small, too quiet, too unsure. James hoped they would find a voice, a teacher, a mentor, a memory that reminded them of something simple and powerful. Strength is not loud. Dignity doesn't argue. Sometimes it simply acts.